and get that bit of that networking feel that we're trying to recapture being virtual. Nicole, if you'd like to start the recording now. Yep, there we go. Help me welcome up to the stage Kurt Wondra for tools for a data project leadership regardless of your title. Clap, clap, clap. You can take over presentation whenever you want. Oh, you're muted, I think. I saw that you were talking, but I'm not hearing you. Still don't hear you.
There we go.
There we go.
The PowerPoint decided to trump everything else that was available on my screen, so I had to click on the other monitor, which is way down there about 5 feet away from me, to get this back up. So far so good into this recording. That's what we've learned. All right, thanks Paul for that introduction. Welcome to Tools for Data Project Leadership, regardless of your title. I believe you all can hear my voice now okay, as well as see the starter slide. Can someone just confirm that for me? Okay, perfect.
Looking good, yep.
All right, so let's go ahead and jump right in. Before I go too far, I do want to make a note. I'm using a handy dandy little clicker here because you'll see me kind of wander a little bit around the room. He was a little touchy in my dry run. So if we end up going 2 slides forward and 1 slide back, please kind of bear with me a little bit. Not really sure why he was acting up, but we will find out as we go along here. All right, so since you guys all gave me a good, see right there, just jumped to already. Since you guys gave me a little introduction on yourselves, let me give you a little bit of background on me. I started with Skyline Technologies way back in October of 2010. And I started on the technical side. I started as a software developer. Fresh out of school, that was something that really interested me and something I wanted to dive into. And I did enjoy the field for quite a while. But I got to a point in my career where I could put a button on the screen and I think about 9 different languages. And I realized I don't want that number to get bigger. I wanted to understand more about why I'm putting that button on the screen. I wanted to understand, am I adding to our revenue bucket? Am I decreasing costs? Am I improving the user experience of maybe a process that's not very friendly to work with? And that kind of led me away from the actual development space and into more of the BA practice. I've gotten a couple certifications along the way, which just makes my email signature that much longer. And at the bottom here, I do want to highlight, there's been times I've been called an Energizer Bunny. And as you can imagine, if someone's used that moniker to describe someone, I'm not going to stand up here and bore you to sleep for the next hour with 0 voice inflections. We're going to have a little bit of fun along the way. I'm very passionate about a lot of this stuff. And since we invest a lot of our lives into the work that we do, we may as well have a little bit of fun and put some energy into it along the way. All right, so let's jump in. I'm curious if any of this sounds familiar, where you think back on your career and you all are great data analysts, you're great developers. You've worked on a couple of awesome projects that have driven some great data insights from your internal teams. And all of a sudden, your boss calls you in and says, hey, since you've done so good at that job, we're going to put you in charge of a brand new team, a brand new high visibility team. And instead of just being in the code or being kind of into the details, we want you to kind of really run the team. Or if you're on a team which maybe has a PM or a BA or a Scrum Master, and there's perhaps some turnover, you end up taking on those responsibilities, either because you politely decided to volunteer or someone voluntold you into that spot. Has that happened to any one of you?
I know that feeling.
All right, I'm seeing.
Raise your hand in the chat or nods. It's good.
Yeah, and I got to imagine you find yourself asking, like, how did I get to this point, right? Because you've had a lot of success being on the technical side and building out these, whether they're data warehouses, data lakes, tabular reports, data visuals. You've had a lot of success there. And all of a sudden you're being asked to step out of that role and into more of a project administration space. Maybe one you haven't been trained in, maybe one you don't have a lot of experience in. It can kind of feel like, wait, why am I here? Can I go back somehow? And it can be a little scary. Trust me, if I was put on a project and they said, Kurt, go write some ETL code, I would be very concerned for the health of that data warehouse. So I can imagine how your fears may work in the opposite direction. So as far as what I have for a roadmap for tonight, I came up with a lot of different topics of items about running a project and running a project effectively and efficiently that I thought I could spend a chunk of time discussing. Now, when you first look at this list, there's 11 total items on here. And we've only got, Nicole told me the next 3 to 4 hours. So I don't want to go too far into the night, but instead of me kind of rambling on and on about each and every one of these, what I'm going to ask is if you can just take a quick peek at each of these items and kind of make a mental note in your head about, hey, is that something that kind of interests me? Or is it something I haven't heard of that I want to learn more of? Because on the next slide, I'm actually going to ask you guys to vote on the ones you want to hear me talk about more. I don't want to spend a disproportionate amount of your time on topics that isn't going to resonate with the group. So as a quick highlight, I can talk for a while about the Scrum framework and the Scrum events. I can talk about team working agreements, how a team decides that they'd like to operate together in an efficient manner. I can talk about scope box definition. That includes defining an MVP and how do you actually get an MVP that is mutually understood by your IT and business stakeholders. I can talk
MVP is?
a minimum viable product.
Thank you.
I can talk about writing a backlog, a list of feature and capability requests that may want to be built into your product. I can talk about how to write good product backlog items and talk about this thing called the definition of ready, which maybe, or I should say, you may or may not have heard before. Can talk about how to prioritize a backlog. Just because you have a 300 item long backlog doesn't mean every item is just as important as every other one. There's got to be a reason why number 1 bubbles to the top and why number 2 bubbles up next. I could also talk about the definition of done. How do we ensure a high level of quality in all of the deliverables from the team? Could also spend some more time on testing and verification. What are some tips and tricks or other approaches that you may find handy? Could talk in depth about how do we track team dependencies, these items outside of the team's control, which directly have an impact to their chance of having success, or everyone's favorite status reports. So I'll likely touch a little bit on all of these, but like I said, I want to focus my energies on those items that matter most to you. So given that list, I'd ask that each of you either pull out your smartphone or look at the side monitor that you have and go over to pollev.com/ well, the URL is at the very top there. And I'm giving each of you 5 votes. So pick the top 5 items that interest you from this list. And if we have a general consensus on a few items, we'll spend the meat and potatoes of this conversation on those 5, and maybe we'll gloss over a few of the other ones. So I'll just pause there. If you have any questions or having a hard time voting, let me know. It looks like at least 1 vote has come in so far, so I'll let you guys leave you guys to it. By the way, do I get bonus points for having like a living, breathing data visual in front of a bunch of data people?
That is awesome. We've only ever had that in 4 years of this meetup, like twice, I think. So thank you.
All right, looks like some more votes are coming in. Anyone having a hard time voting?
Anybody need more time voting? Type it into the chat now. What do you think? 10 seconds?
I think 10 seconds would be good.
All right. 5 seconds.
All right. So it looks like we've got a top 4. Most people are concerned about a definition of done. We'll definitely spend some added time there. Also with prioritizing the backlog. Ooh, that's a good one. I could talk for a long time on that. Thank you for picking that one. And then working agreements. And this one actually becomes more interesting in the post-COVID world that we're in, where we do have a lot more blended teams, especially in terms of geography and time zones. And then track dependencies is number 4. So we'll likely spend a little bit of time on everything, including the Scrum framework and building a backlog, which got the fewest votes. I'll just gloss over those a little bit, but then we'll move on to some of the other topics that you've voted a little bit more for. All right, so to start off with, we've got the Scrum framework. I'm guessing most folks here do have some sort of Agile experience. So I'm not trying to cram a whole bunch of Agile know-how into the next 2 minutes here, but I did just want to highlight the 5 main events of any Scrum project. You've got your sprint, typically 2 or 3 weeks in duration, where the team builds out the deliverables. Sprint planning is what kicks off the given sprint. It defines the work to be done by the team. Your daily Scrum, it's a daily checkpoint. What did I do yesterday? What am I going to do today? What are my blockers? Then we have a sprint review, which really serves as an opportunity for the team to showcase the awesome work that they did. A lot of people confuse sprint review and they say it has to be a demo. It doesn't have to be a demo, but it does have to be something where the team can showcase the work that they did in the interest of getting feedback from their stakeholders and or product owner. By the way, it looks like I should also spell the term also with an S, not a C, in sprint review. Maybe I should have sought some feedback prior to putting this in front of you. And then we have sprint retrospective, which is a chance to regroup as a team after each sprint and say, hey, what went good? What didn't go so good? What might we want to change? And what might we want to change can actually have ripple effects on all of the other topics that I have here in this PowerPoint. One thing I would point you to, which is really handy, and I even find myself going out to it a lot, is this scrumguides.org site that you see on the left-hand side. They've taken the Scrum Guide and actually built it into an HTML web page, which is really easy to navigate, where you can directly view the definitions of all of these events, plus all of the other pieces regarding the Scrum Guide. So if you ever need to kind of go back and understand, hey, what's my true north with this particular Agile related event? This is actually a really useful tool and a really easy one to quickly reference. Also have this handy dandy visual, which outlines kind of the Scrum framework in a nutshell. And going from left to right across the screen, we've got this product backlog. Contains the list of features and capabilities we want to build into our product. That can include bringing data into a warehouse. That can include building out new tabular reports. That can include building out new Tableau dashboards. You name it, all of the above. Pieces of that product backlog, typically the top prioritized pieces, flow into the sprint planning meeting. That's the meeting where the team says, in the next sprint, again, typically 2 to 3 weeks, here are the items we think we can get to done per our definition of done. That forms the sprint backlog. And in a nutshell, your sprint backlog is just a subset of your product backlog. It's the topmost items. It's the X number that you grabbed and brought into the sprint. Each day, the team keeps working, chugging through those efforts with the touch point each day of the daily Scrum. Hopefully your teams are communicating more than just at the daily Scrum. If they only talk at that point, that's probably a warning sign, so keep that in mind. Then at the end of the sprint, we perform the sprint review to get some feedback from a product owner and other stakeholders. And then we've got an integrated increment that we can move forward from. That then paves the way for the retrospect to talk about how things went, and then you start the process on over again. I know that was, yep, go ahead.
So thinking about like projects and how the Agile approach fits or doesn't fit, like if you were thinking about like building a civil engineering project like a bridge, when an agile process doesn't necessarily work, you don't want somebody driving across the river on your minimum viable product, right? In an IT space, like I've got a client right now, which is pretty committed to the waterfall approach. In an IT space, is there ever a situation from your point of view where waterfall is superior to Scrum, where you would advise a client to use it?
Yeah, each methodology definitely does have its advantages. And it's a good analogy you called out there, Jeremiah, about a physical project like building a bridge over a river versus software development. Luckily, in the technical world, we don't have to abide by some of the tangible physics of like building a bridge over the river. For example, you need that concrete to actually be solid all the way over the bridge before you're going to actually start painting it, right? Because you're not going to run that big equipment over the bridge to actually paint it until that concrete is dry. Whereas in more of an agile approach, metaphorically speaking, you might build out the first 8 feet of that bridge before you build out the next 200 feet of it. Now, to your question of, are there times where waterfall fits better? I'm going to say yes, there are. Agile and Scrum are not a one size fits all. I think they get celebrated because it allows companies to be more nimble, and it allows companies to make changes much more sooner than a typical waterfall project would. So for example, I think back in, it was 2014, I was on a waterfall development project, and I wasn't there when the project started, and I also wasn't there when the project ended, but I think I was there for about a full year. From the time that project initiated, all those dollars went into building out that particular IT software, and the dollars went up, and the risk went up every single step of the way for about 4 different years until they finally released that software product. Now, what that means is the company had to invest constantly for 4 years, while at that same time getting $0 in ROI. Now, that's a really long time for a lot of directors and VPs and C-level folks to wait, especially when you're talking about a multi-million-dollar project, especially when you're getting up there in the 7 to 8 figures in terms of investment. Now, you also have to look at your team and your staff and how they typically work. You probably can't throw the Scrum framework on a team of 100 developers who are very skilled in waterfall. It's likely not going to work. Does that kind of help address the question?
Kind of, yeah. So the only situation that it sounds like from your point of view where waterfall is better is when people are just really used to it.
There's some other considerations. They're a little bit more like nuanced. Think of server upgrades, for example. Sometimes those are situations where you need to flip a switch off and then flip a different switch on. There's not really a lot of intermediary or middle states when you're retiring maybe a server or server rack. It's a clean slate. Typically in software development or enhancing data warehouse, data lakes, you have a chance of building a foundation and then evolving it over time. So I think if you have that chance to produce something that is of some sort of tangible value, and you can get feedback from maybe your stakeholders and even your end users, but keep growing that value, Scrum's probably a better fit. But where it's got to be a big bang changeover, waterfall is likely a better approach.
That's helpful. Thank you.
Mm-hmm. Any other questions?
Paul, there appears to be another question from Haley.
Hi there, Paul, or Kurt. Paul? Kurt. No. I'm
Kurt.
looking at Paul.
Kurt.
Kurt's talking. Yeah, I have a question about so waterfall versus Scrum. They all have their sort of theoretical advantages and disadvantages. In practice, in your experience, and maybe Jeremiah, this would overlap with you too, most of these things aren't run like exactly as they appear in the box, so to speak. There's frequently a kind of an idealized theoretical way in which Scrum would be perfect and Agile would all roll out real nice and smooth, and what the conditions under which waterfall would work beautifully as well. So I feel like most of the time, at least all the students I've encountered, many of the students I've got out there, say that a lot of times there's hybrids of these things that are sort of you've got a bunch of people that are really used to waterfall, and they're trying to move more into the Scrum world and the Agile world or whatever. And so I guess my question is one of these like better as like a second best? Like if Scrum is done imperfectly, is that better than waterfall and done imperfectly, assuming a roughly similar level of imperfection? Or does one really fall off the cliff when it's not done pretty close to spec?
I'm going to answer and say it depends.
Okay, like a true economist.
Yes, unfortunately, we can't take the Scrum Guide or the Agile Manifesto and just go into an organization and say, boom, run your IT department this way, you'll get the maximum amount of success. There always are adaptations you need to make along the way, be it for, well, it could be for a lot of different reasons. I won't get on the long list of them. Typically, what you try to do is bring in a framework. Start with the textbook, whether you're doing waterfall or Agile, and find the areas where you think, hey, this is going to cause some friction internally because of how we operate or because of some, I'll call it organizational baggage that we have to bring to the table, and find ways to adapt to still operate in whichever framework you picked, but make some adjustments along the way based upon what you also have to deal with on a day in and day out basis. And kind of what I like about the Agile framework, especially Scrum, is you get that retrospective every 2 weeks to kind of do a litmus test. Hey, how are we doing? Hey, what's maybe not efficient? Hey, what do we wish we could change? There's not really a call out event in waterfall. It's gather a bunch of requirements, do a bunch of development, do a bunch of testing, and then hopefully we all go live by some magical date that management picked. There's not really a chance to stop and say, hey, we could be more efficient and effective on how we do this.
Great, thanks.
Yeah, the best approach is, I'd say, start with the textbook, but don't be of the belief, or don't be so idealistic that you think the textbook solves all. Bring that in, start there, and adapt from it.
Yeah, that's why I asked. I mean, the theoretical ideal rarely, applies in reality. So the question is, what does the second best version look like? And you answered, obviously it depends. So anyway, thank you.
No problem. Probably the most efficient and effective approach that I've seen is a Agile-like approach that has a few sprinkles of a project management perspective in it. That's been an approach I found that's worked across lots of different clients, multiple different projects in different industries. That seems to be as close to a Swiss Army knife as I've seen. All right.
I can say from a stakeholder perspective, and everything Kurt's saying is absolutely dead on from what my experience has been. The challenge I see with Agile more times than not is what's done look like and when is it? And when I hear we'll tell you we'll be farther every 2 weeks. Well, that makes me, start twitching around.
That's a bad answer.
It is.
Because that's them saying, I'll spend your money for 2 more weeks and I'll let you know where we're at.
Right.
Mm-hmm. And that'll play into the definition of done a little bit too when we get there. All right, I'll move along. I'll go into working agreements. This was one of our top vote getters. So what's a working agreement? A working agreement is a set of guidelines that a team decides that to notate about how they're going to operate day in and day out. One thing that's always interesting in the world of IT is we form these brand new teams and we reshuffle the organization and we put new people reporting to so-and-so and we put these other teams together that never worked together before. And we kind of expect them to operate like a high-performing team right out of the gate. But we don't really give them any parameters or standard operating procedures for how to run their team. It's one thing if we were in a manufacturing organization and, hey, look, my second shift just got done on the assembly line where I take a widget, I paint it blue, and I put it back on the belt. If I punch out and Paul comes in, Paul's going to go right to the assembly line, grab the widget, paint it blue, put it on the line, and move on. We don't really need a set working agreement because the job is so repetitive and understood. We're building a lot of custom solutions in the world we live in. It's not like an assembly line. Not everything is overly repetitive. So who builds this working agreement? This is something that the team should document probably at the very start of a project. You certainly can build it halfway in. That's totally okay. Better late than never. But the team members themselves have to be the ones to build out this list. And it's got to be rooted in the interest of productivity. The fine line here is that some folks think, oh, well, let's just define a working agreement that's convenient for me. Like I want to be done by 3 o'clock every day during summer because it's sunny outside. Okay, that shouldn't really constitute something that gets into the working agreement. But if there are people who have to get their kids off of school or care for an elderly member of their family who lives at home and has a recurring appointment, that's different, right? Then it does constitute a line item which should likely find its way into a working agreement. And this working agreement, typically it'll be a several different bullet points, maybe a half page in length, so it's not very long at all. It should be saved someplace in a centralized that the team always has access to it. They could always pull it open. So whether that's in Microsoft Teams or that's in a shared network directory, make sure it's a spot where everyone can look. And also this provides some good, kind of seeding information for when you get into the sprint retrospective, because maybe some of your working agreements were violated over the last 2 to 3 weeks. Maybe we need to revisit those working agreement bullet points, perhaps adjust them or add to it, or maybe delete one, which is maybe no longer relevant. It's funny to me how many unspoken assumptions we all have, and I'm not immune to this. I have a certain, I'll say, baggage that I kind of bring into any project, and I don't really speak it. It's just in terms of how I tend to work. And I also tend to assume everyone else knows how I tend to work and that they're going to work in a way that just pieces in right with how I work. Like that's not reality. So, on the left-hand side, I have a few examples of typical things I've seen in working agreements. One is defining a set of core working hours. And this would be a set of hours where unless you've notated to the team you have something pulling you elsewhere, like you're going to be working from 9 to 3 p.m. Maybe you have to define a time zone, especially if you're working with people who are geographically diverse. But this gives those early birds a chance to maybe punch in at 7 and be done by 3. And the ones who like to sleep in the morning a chance to start at 9 and work until 5. Maybe you have a production support cycle. How do you staff it? Is it a rotation? Joe does it, then Sally, then Steve, and then Joe, Sally, Steve. Or I've been at one client before where the members of the team who are on payroll, who are on the payroll of the organization, felt like they should be on production support more often because they're an employee of the company. So it typically went that person, then one of the consultants, then the other employee, a different consultant, then employee A, another consultant. So they put their schedule into the working agreement. Another big one that comes up a lot is how does time off get communicated? I think when people communicate time off, that can be in so many different ways. It's kind of funny to me. Some people send an email. Some people update their calendar. Some people will put an event on your calendar. Some people will send an IM. Some people will just say it in Scrum the day before. I think I've seen 20 different ways for people to communicate when they won't be at work doing what they would typically do. And if you have inconsistency there, especially on a big team, it's very hard to manage where people on that big team are. And you'll find yourselves chasing around to look for folks who had already communicated they're going to be out of the office. Other examples I've seen are, meetings start 2 minutes past the hour. If you've got a 9:30 meeting, you will start it by 9:32. Who's late is late. That is what it is. Or, update your tasks in Azure DevOps or Rally, update them daily. What questions do you guys have here? Like I said earlier, this was a big vote getter.
Feel free to unmute.
If the membership of your project team changes on a weekly basis, like you lose people and get new people every week, including leadership, do you have any best practices from a working agreement perspective to like that's a fraught situation? There's no way it's not going to be frustrating, but is there anything that you can put in a working agreement that can help make it less frustrating?
Yeah, I would say there are definitely things you could do to help. Like you said, that is an uphill battle with that kind of a rotation going on. A couple things that come to mind are you could add in the working agreement that anytime someone new joins the team, they are given the working agreement and an existing member of the team reviews it with them within 5 business days, some sort of an onboarding period. You could also have something baked into that working agreement that says new members of the team will kind of shadow an existing team member for X amount of time until that team member feels, yep, they understand the actual working agreements. You could, if you really wanted to, create a little online survey of like multiple choice questions. What are the core working hours in our team working agreement? And if people get 80% or more, you can say, yes, I know you at least read the document. I don't really love that third item, but I'm just saying there's things you could do there. One of the main things as well, just to make this document ever visible, and anytime someone new does come to the team, make sure that they know where this document lives, make sure they know that it exists, and ensure that they do take time to read over it and provide any feedback that they have.
Kurt, how often do you see teams being able to do this on their own without their leader really kind of sponsoring this, kind of pushing this effort? It strikes me as a very top-down type of thing versus hey, I'm a peer with these 3 other folks. I'm gonna introduce working agreements because that'll make them a fan of me right off the bat.
Yeah, that's a great one, right? Because bad habits breed bad results, good habits breed good results, and this tends to fall under that bucket of a good habit. If you're on a few high performing teams, chances are you've seen this in action, you've seen it work well, almost to the point where the irony is that the team kind of works themselves out of needing a team agreement because they've all adapted their approaches just a little bit, so it gels much better with the whole team around them, right? So you do need a couple of motivated individuals within the team who care about this. And sometimes you might actually need 1 or 2 team members, I'll say even to be a little bit vulnerable, right? Because it's hard to admit to your colleagues that, hey, I need to take off at 3 every day because my parent isn't doing so good and I need to do something for them every Tuesday and Thursday at 3 o'clock. That's a vulnerable place to be that we really shouldn't have to force our teammates to come out and say it. The rest of us should say, hey, let's define some individual working parameters of when we all expect to be logged in so that if we do have a production issue or anything else pop up, we can reasonably rely on your availability. I think this is one of those pieces where someone's got to see it and do it and see it reap success before they're going to be bold enough to take it with them into their next team. And typically I see this being brought up by the scrum master on a given team. So if you find yourself on a team where you are the scrum master and you don't have someone who is more traditionally trained, it's not something that comes right to mind to you.
Yeah, Nicole points out it's hard being a peer and trying to introduce these kinds of things. To me, what I was struck by is this is not just a data projects or IT thing or even an agile thing. This relates to how to have, some little framework around team culture. And for me, in my career, I've had the fortune of being able to speak frankly as I start on a team with a new boss to say these kinds of boundaries defined are good for team cohesion and for me. So we're going to take some time to talk about these from the perspective with my leader and with my peers. And it's been a matter of bringing that forward and sometimes having to say that this time to take and define these boundaries a little bit is needed, boss. That's part of why you hired me. That's been my experience.
Yep, that makes sense. Nothing that shows up on a working agreement is rocket science, and nothing is going to seem out of the ordinary. But it's amazing how many unspoken assumptions can be kind of wiped away by just getting some of these bullet points down on paper.
Sure. Sue, you have your hand raised.
Yeah, I was curious, Kurt, what about agreements with stakeholders on, questions around requirements possibly? Is that part of the working agreement? Are they in this working agreement? And then also, on the flip side of that, like UAT, like, you know, people who are performing in user acceptance testing on things, is there agreements about timeframes and responsiveness?
Lots of good topics there. You could include stakeholders into your working agreements. I would probably shy away from that unless you're going to interact with those stakeholders almost on a daily basis. You know, this document is kind of meant to be very internal to the team. You know, and part of the Scrum Master's role is to help ensure that the team continues to operate that way day in and day out, including ensuring some of those occasional players, like maybe a stakeholder that you see once a week, informing them of how they can work most efficiently with the group. But I could see a reason to bring them in. I could also see a point where you've got 25 people in your meeting talking about working agreements and you never get anything decided. Now, your question about what about UAT testing or what about environments? I often defer that into the definition of done, where in a perfect world, not a perfect world, but I'll say a Kurt preferred world, we've got code that moves from a local machine to a dev environment, which is shared, to a UAT environment, which is shared, and eventually onto production land. And I like to work in the UAT environment because that's like that last toll gate before production. That's where code should move to. It should be the most production-like piece. And typically we're not doing a ton of wonky scenarios where we might just be doing some, I'll say, more in-depth testing and perhaps like a dev environment would. So you could put some of that into the working agreement that maybe your testers and BAs would primarily use the staging environment. Sorry, I'm bleeding together UNT and UAT because that's based on the project I'm on. Sorry, dev and stage, I should say. Maybe your testers and BAs typically work in this space, but yet your active development team may work a little bit further downstream for the majority of their interactions with the code. Does that help or not really?
Yeah, I was just really curious about, you know, can you have agreements around responsive, you know, maybe timelines or something like that? Like, you know, UAT will be performed within 2 weeks of something going to the test environment, or, you know, something like that. Or stakeholders, if we have questions around requirements, you know, there's a working agreement with them that they'll respond within 24 hours, almost like an SLA kind of thing.
You know, the one thing I've seen that works there, Sue, is when you communicate outwardly. If we don't hear a response to a requirements clarification question within 48 hours, that story will be blocked. And we will bring it up every single daily scrum until it's unblocked.
Okay.
Because those stakeholders don't want the bullseye on their back. So once they know, hey, I've got 48 hours or 24 hours or whatever you decide, that tends to kind of ump the urgency a bit.
Okay, that makes sense.
But even,
Brian?
you know, whatever number you pick, right? We're setting an expectation. Let's say it is 24 hours and you're communicating it. It's not an unspoken expectation that a shareholder or a stakeholder drop anything they're doing just because they get an email from the tech team.
Yep. Thanks.
Hi there.
I got a question.
Yeah. Oh, is it me?
Yep. Go ahead.
Okay. Guy with a lot of facial hair. Okay. I'm wondering about accountability with these working agreements. As I think about the many interactions I've had with students and my spouse, even about Scrum roles, and she herself was a Scrum Master at various times in her career. And one thing that I've often heard stories of is the accountability. It's like someone was asking about, does leadership drive these working agreements, and how do we enforce the agreements that are set forth in the working agreement? And this is where on the academic side, you might talk to my psychologist or sociologist colleagues, and they'll say, well, you have to appeal to people's identity, and then they'll want to be part of the agreement, and et cetera. Economists, like myself, are way more cynical. We're more like, yeah, what are the incentives and what's the accountability? And if those things don't exist, these things can either not function at all, or they can function quite sloppily, and there can be delays and lots of absences, and progress can really be slowed. So I'm wondering, A, what kind of accountability can you build into these things that's like has teeth so that people comply? I guess I'll start it kind of reminds you of the old phrase, culture eats strategy for breakfast. If the culture isn't going to support this in a either self-motivated way or a leadership way, how do you make these things cohere?
Yeah, that's a good call out, right? Working agreement can't teach someone to care. It can't teach someone to care about their team around them. It can't teach someone to just have intrinsic value about what they're building and really get, emotionally into it. It can't do that. Typically what I've seen is if you at least have people that care a little bit and take a little bit of pride in their work, that's the starting point that you need. And then you can either go with, I'll say a little bit of friendly punishments, or you could go with a gamification approach with how you enforce this. So I've been on teams where when someone violates a team working agreement, guess who's bringing in donuts the next day? Or guess who's buying the first round of beers at the next happy hour? Or guess who's in the COVID world, guess who's the one who has to drop off the next round of beers at everyone's houses to pay for their violation of the working agreement rule? I've also seen the gamification approach where perhaps you do have multiple members of the team that break multiple working agreement items each sprint. Then you may need to find a way to reward the people who break it the fewest. And again, you could do some sort of a system like donuts or beverages for that matter. Or you could just do something else a little bit goofy and say employee of the sprint and put that person's face on a little Microsoft Word document. And then it becomes a contest kind of each sprint to see, can someone dethrone the current person who has broken the working agreement the fewest amount of times. To make this work, though, the team needs to be bought into the working agreement. The team needs to hold each other accountable to it. And there will become times where one team member will have to have a difficult conversation with another team member where, hey, there was a production support issue at 1 p.m. And Joe, I had no idea where you were. You went on a 3-hour lunch and I was hung out to dry because the VP of HR was screaming down my neck about this outage and I had no one to go to and I couldn't get a hold of you and you didn't communicate it. So some of those conversations have to happen, but hopefully if you started with a group of team members who do take a little bit of pride in that work and in their team effort, that should be the starting point that this working agreement can help excel them to having that ability of being bought in themselves and helping to hold others accountable to it. Now, sometimes if you're the one building this working agreement, it may be a good idea for you to break one of the working agreement items just to see if someone calls you out on it. Because if they do, that's awesome. Take it on the chin and celebrate the fact that they held you accountable. If they don't, then you need to talk about, hey, are you guys actually going to use this or not? It's a different conversation at that point.
All right.
I have one quick related question.
Mhm.
That's to do with, this is more about constituency of teams as they're built when you're trying to decide on a team for a particular project or what your team is. I realize sometimes these are fixed, sometimes they may be more fluid. If it's a special project, you might move people over or whatever. And how vulnerable are projects in this pipeline, these working agreements, to some of the things you mentioned, like a team member missing, or hourly issues, or elder care, or underperformance issues, or other types of delays. Does it get to the point where it's death by 1,000 pinpricks, where these working agreements can get kind of swamped or submerged by this never-ending, sort of litany of minor issues that kind of clog the flow? Is that a common experience in this framework, and if so, how do you navigate that? It's similar to my first question, I guess.
Mm-hmm. I guess I haven't seen that. I think the longest working agreements I've seen have been 20 bullet points long. So like in cases where you have someone doing elder care, someone picking up and dropping off kids, or someone with a spouse who has an odd schedule, for example, you try to find more of the similarity among their situations versus the differences. So like I wouldn't write 3 different bullet points for Sally needs off at 2 p.m., Jim won't be in until 9, and Stacy has to take off Tuesday and Thursday afternoons. I would try to hone in on hey, could we all plan to be online between 10 and noon and 1 to 3? You know, let's try to find some common ground, which still provides flexibility for the rest of us, but yet we want to maximize the capability of our team collaborating together versus just being a random set of developers and BAs and PMs that are assigned to a particular team, you know, from someone in leadership. So I think it's about where is the common ground that gives people the different flexibility options they're likely looking for.
Okay. Yeah, I was just asking because I'm wondering, how does this relate to cross functionality? Like, if you have multiple people doing numerous sort of pieces of a project, if one person's missing, you don't lose the continuity for a particular day of work, right? And I sense you're reworking then. So anyway, I'll yield to your. I don't want to keep clogging up the time here.
That's a good call out. You know, I tend to separate out like the actual day in and day out work responsibilities into a different exercise that I call a roles and responsibilities exercise, and that details more of who's writing the code, who's testing the code, who's providing the. Why can't I think of it right now? What's it called when like a senior developer approves someone else's code? It's like PR approvals. You know, who's writing the status reports, who's verifying the AC. Some of those pieces get taken out to a different exercise. This one's just more focused on maybe more of the soft components of within what parameters can we work together effectively and efficiently.
Yeah, that's really interesting. You know, I'm an academic, as I mentioned, and I'll just say this one thing, and I'll try to yield. Paul knows I'm a talker, so he should have muted me from the start. Anyway, I kind of, as my wife's always worked in the private sector, public sector, and so I've always had that. Plus, I've got reams of students now out there, and they describe project management and project processes, and it's all very interesting. I'm just a curious sort, and so I try to draw the analogy to what I do in the academic sphere that sort of parallels what might be a data project that you experience in the private sector. And the closest thing I come up with is sort of a research paper that we do to publish articles. And we frequently work in quote teams, authorship teams, 2 to 5 people potentially. But what's different about, at least I think is different about what we do in that paradigm, which is, I guess you could say it's similar. There's a deliverable, there's a process, there's data, there's often coding, at least in my field, and there's a lot of statistics and machine learning and stuff in there too. What we do is usually every author does everything farm to table. So if there's 5 of us, we'll basically each do all the parts of the paper from one to start to finish, and we have a lot of overlap because there's not near as much segmentation of the tasks. And my sense is the business world is very segmented, and each person does to the 5-yard line, and the next person does 5 to 10, the next person does 10 to 15, and so on. And I'm wondering, is that metaphor make sense to you, or is it more like the process I'm familiar with in my world?
Again,
I'm not a sports guy. Okay, I know. I'm in trouble now.
For the sake of the conversation, could you say yes?
So I do wear Packers stuff on, in the fall.
Gotcha.
I'm not a non-Packers fan.
So let's imagine you were a Packers fan, right? Do you care that they went from the 20-yard line over to the 30-yard line on the other side of the field? Or do you care if they score points and get a touchdown or kick a field goal?
Well, I guess I care a little bit about the first thing, and obviously more about the second thing.
Yeah, the yardage.
First downs are good. Scoring is even better, right?
Correct. The yardage represents progress, but doesn't represent anything that's added main value yet. In a sports analogy, once you get on that scoreboard, that's the business value which has been achieved. That's the ROI which is now coming back, right? So that's kind of the way that I would look at that. And I have been on a number of teams where, while we do have lots of skill sets, someone likes to say, "Nope, this is my job. I write the extract logic."
Gotcha.
That's it.
Yep.
Those kind of people are harder to work with because they're not flexible. They can't span into some of the other areas, and they kind of pigeonhole themselves, unfortunately, as well. So business value doesn't come from just a particular layer, right? Points don't come from getting first downs. You get business value when, boom, we get that data out of the source system and into the warehouse so the data scientists can actually use it. That's when we can start making money off of the extraction and the transform and the load.
Yeah, no, I totally agree. I mean, it's just, the metaphor crosses over to my world too, where you don't get any credit till that paper is published. It's the same idea. You got to have the touchdown. But I guess the difference that I'm sensing based on the conversations is there's this culture in my realm where a lot of people are, I guess, sort of mega cross-functional. Like they do the data, the equivalent of ETL. We go and get data, we extract it from whatever data sources we need. We transform it, we move it, we do, statistics and machine learning, whatever we need to do on it. We then write it, we then test it to make sure, robustness and all this kind of stuff. So I think the metaphor kind of crosses over. I'm just curious why or if the business world does it much more specialized, kind of production line process where there's, people, like you say, do it in pieces and then hand the baton off to the next person, or if there's more of this sort of high degree of cross-functionality. And the reason I'm thinking the cross-functionality might be useful is that if you lose people in and out of these working groups, but you still have, the other people are pretty broad farm to table, you're gonna be able to preserve the continuity of what that team is trying to accomplish, even if you have missing people any given day. You know what I'm saying?
Yeah, I think just in short, I would say your folks that are flexible and can wear a number of different hats on a given day, that means they can help solve a lot more problems than just someone who's only specialized in their lane. Because if that work stream dries up, is that employee needed anymore? That's a harder question to have.
Sure. Okay, I've talked way too much.
I was gonna say we only had 2 now. We got to keep moving, guys.
All right, let's keep moving. Let's talk. Let me click over here so that my handy dandy clicker down here will work. Let's talk about scope box definition. This one didn't get a ton of votes, so I'll go over this one fairly quickly. I could also phrase this as defining an MVP, as Nicole pointed out earlier, a minimum viable product. One thing I've seen, even a lot of BAs, right, who have business analyst in their title and do this for a profession, they have a hard time defining what the scope of their team's work is going to be for maybe a particular release or a particular key date or whatever the case might be. Unfortunately, the thing that I've seen, and it makes my skin go, or makes my hairs crawl on the back of my neck, is that people will define an MVP by saying, well, we'll get done by whatever we get done, or we'll get done whatever we do by this date because the VP said we're deploying on this date. That is not a minimum viable product. That is going after it way backwards. And like the comment that was made earlier, that does not give your stakeholders nor your project sponsors any confidence. That's like me saying, dropping my car off at the shop and saying, okay, well, I want an oil change. And when they tell me it'll be done by 4, when I pick it up, if they have the oil plug out and no oil in it, there's no reason for me to hop in that car and use it. It's not usable yet, right? Just because you get something done by a certain timeline does not define the scope. And by the way, I fully expect that shop to keep my vehicle and actually finish the job, not just give me a car with no oil in it, right? So regarding defining a scope, again, I encourage people, get out a Microsoft Word doc, get out some bullet points and a few headers, and write down, here's what's in scope for our project, our budget. And as much as important as the in scope section is, also write down what's out of scope. A lot of times when you get into these meetings, your stakeholders, your project sponsors, they have these amazing ideas of things they want to build someday. The unicorns, butterflies, and rainbows world where they have every single piece of data and every report and every interactive alert. The functionality they're describing might be limitless, but chances are your budget and your timeline are not. So you may need to explicitly call out a number of items that are out of scope and put them on that document. I would highly recommend you establish this document as early in your project as possible, because the closer and closer you get to that planned delivery date, the harder it is to get alignment. Really what you're trying to do with putting this on paper, again, is to establish some sort of a harmony and expectations between what your business stakeholders are asking for and what IT thinks is feasible to deliver. Now, it might be feasible to deliver by a timeline, or it might be feasible to deliver by a given budget amount, or it might be defining the timeline for a set scope. It can work either way, but in general, you're trying to just assign, you're trying to get to that piece of harmony where both the business and IT stakeholders say, yep, I think we have a plan to move forward. Now, here's the interesting part. Just because you created this handy dandy document, and just because you've saved it someplace where people can always access it, it doesn't stop our minds from continuing to scope creep. And it even happens to us as team members, right? As we're building out a new report, we're like, oh, you know what would be great here is if we had this other piece of data that's in the source system that we haven't grabbed yet. We kind of scope creep on ourselves, right? It's almost like yeast in bread or like weeds that grow in my backyard. It grows and you know it's there. I can't actually see the moment it happens, but I can prove to you that it does happen. But always having this document to go back to, it realigns everyone to say, hey, look, our goal was this scope as we defined it 2 months ago, 2 years ago, 6 weeks ago, whatever it was. That is our goal. Now, I'm not saying you can't make adjustments to it. I'm just saying that was the plan, right? If you bring more scope in, that probably means your budget or your timeline has to adjust. But at least you're starting from the same understanding point. And you as an IT resource, you're not just saying, hey, product owner, that means I need more cash. Or that means you're not going to hit your timeline. You need to have something to back it up.
Sure.
So Kirk, with this, this is where I see these things fall over all the freaking time, because I think about requirements gathering, I think about discovery, I think about feasibility, all that type of stuff that you talk about waterfall. All those things start at the beginning of waterfall before you get to the execution plan and things like that. With this, where did those things occur? Do those occur before defining the MVP? Do they occur after defining the MVP? Because that's where the scope really gets very, very squishy.
Mm-hmm. This should happen as part of defining what that MVP is. So this actually kind of plays in a little bit with when we get to backlog prioritization too, because I've had scope docs where we'll write out, here's the high level capability we intend to deliver. Let's say we were Amazon, right? We want to build the ability for users to purchase products from our store. Okay, that's a high level capability. When we get into prioritizing what that breaks down to, does that mean we need to support paying via credit card? Do we need to support paying via check? Do we need to support paying via a credit memo? Do we need to support paying via Bitcoin? Do we need to support all these other methods? Probably not. There's probably a few of them which we absolutely need to that are reasonably agreed to, but there's probably a few options there which, hey, that's for someday. Let's leave it on the backlog, but nothing we have to bubble up at the right now. I sense from your facial expressions, I might not be answering your question very well.
No. This always just feels like a bit of a moving target because so much of the value is learning as you go and iterating. But then it's, again, thinking from the stakeholder side, I want to know what done is so that I can tell my peers, I can set their expectations. They're not going to quite frankly care about what did we learn this week. They're going to care about, hey, you told me we're going to have this new function that's bringing value to our customers on this date. So where is it? and before we even start heading down that path, that's the way they're going to be wound. Functionality by what date to create business value at that point. So again, it's just that challenge of how do you give enough at this point, knowing that, okay, you're going to learn, you're going to iterate. And that's quite frankly, so much of the value of this is going to be better. It's going to be better quicker as you go through it, but still have enough there to be able to say, yeah, this is a commitment. This is a hard commitment to the business. This is what you're going to get.
Yeah, it is a tough science, and even some of the better BAs still struggle with this. I was even on a project a while ago where we did define a scope box. We did prioritize. We had must, needs, and wants, and I can get into that in a little bit here. But we got, I would say, about halfway into the project where brand new information and brand new requirements presented itself. That never happens to you guys, right? You never have new requirements?
Nope, never.
Now, there always is some flexibility in your scope box, or I'll say it this way, there should be some flexibility in your scope box for new information to present itself, but we're talking like this much more information, not this many more requirements that come out of left field. So even if something isn't notated on that scope box definition, that doesn't mean that something new out of left field just automatically gets slid in because the business says so. Now, chances are we can move it in, but what does that do to the timeline and or the budget? Right? And if we do want to move some new scope in, can we take some of the prior identified scope, can we move it out so that it's not just putting more cars on the back of the train? You know, can we get these new deliverables up there and deprioritize some of the ones that we used to think were important? And it does involve a conversation of, it's not a blame game. I mean, business shouldn't point to IT to say, I told you about this, and IT shouldn't point the finger back at the business saying, you keep changing your mind all the darn time. We need to come together and say, what is driving this project? Is it the timeline? Is it the scope? Or is it the budget? And if it's the scope, okay, well, if we change that, it's going to have ripple effects on the other two. And contrarily, right, if it's the timeline, it's going to have impacts on the other two. So what's most important? Then how do we tweak the scope to fit within that constraint?
All right. Next.
All right. Next, I'll go to establishing a product backlog. I'll skim over this one real quick. Your product backlog is the listing of all deliverables that you eventually want to build into your product. It does not have to be contained to your scope box. It does not have to be just the must stories that you're looking to accomplish. This can contain the butterflies, unicorns, and rainbows world that your business owners said, oh, I want this, that, and the other thing. You know, items that may not even be budgeted for in the next 5 years. That's fine. You can put it on your product backlog. Think of it as an ever-growing and evolving wish list of items that someday may want to be built into your product. And by product in this context, I'll just say like it's the overall data structure that you're supporting. So it might be the data warehouse plus data lake plus, I don't know, data pond, data ocean, data barn, whatever cool things you guys are doing these days. It could include your more tabular reports, data visuals, active alerting, whatever it is. Think of all that as encapsulating within your product. You know, also one thing to consider is don't be afraid to create what I call shell product backlog items, where sometimes you only have a title because you know this idea is 2 years down the road. Just put a few scratch notes in that item, get it on the list, and know that you'll come back to it later. One thing about us, go ahead.
I was gonna say, how high was this one voted?
Let's go back. We had.
Yeah, this one I thought was pretty high. Okay. Type your questions in now. Sorry, go ahead, Kurt.
Nope, totally fine. I will just pause if there is a question. Otherwise, I'm going to keep moving on in the interest of time.
Sure.
Right, creating and refining product backlogs. This is a topic very near and dear to me. I could go on for a very long time on this, but because I like you guys, I'm not going to. I'm just going to kind of focus on that last bullet point there on the left-hand side. To me, there's 3 main elements of writing strong product backlog items. You need a short, concise, and mutually understandable title of that product backlog item. And by that, I mean your business stakeholders, to your project sponsor, to your dev team. If they read that title, they have a strong understanding of what's likely to be included within the scope of that story. Second, you need a description. This is where you provide some background, some storytelling. This is where you provide a little bit more context about why time and money was spent gathering these requirements in the first place. This is where you can include those stories like Joe in accounting has to do a manual set of steps every Tuesday for 8 hours to accomplish a certain task, This is where you build some of that in. You build it into the description field. And then lastly, you have your acceptance criteria, which aims to get as unambiguous as possible and states directly how success is measured. So for example, eye color and hair color attributes are brought into our dim contact table for every contact that is known in our sales system. Right? That's pretty cut and dry. There's not a lot of gray in that statement. And then your test cases are built around that acceptance criteria, whereas your value is really articulated a lot in the description.
How important is the who? I see what and why as strong parts of this, good definition, but the who doesn't seem to be mentioned. Is that a big strong piece or not as strong as those?
I think I'm kind of baking the who into both of those.
Okay.
So not that Joe is wanting an automated process, but Joe doesn't want to be pulling out his hair every other Tuesday is kind of the why. So, and who this actually impacts does matter a little bit, right? Sometimes when you have something that will directly impact your end users, you will likely prioritize it higher versus something where only your technical staff who has like backdoor access and has a workaround, that'll likely get deprioritized. But still, you will want to notate who this adds the most value to.
Good. Any other questions? Jump in, or we're going to keep moving. All right.
I just have a quick example of a backlog here. I put this in here to prove you don't need a fancy tool like Jira or Azure DevOps or Rally to have a backlog. I created this in Trello, which is a free tool. I created a number of different columns which represent the life cycle of a given item in the backlog. And kind of the main ones I just want to draw your attention to here is we've got a ready for approval column, third from the left. This would be where I would move items into before our product owner reviews and says, yep, those are the right requirements. Let's go and build that. The column just to the right of it would be where they drag and drop it in. And that's where the development team knows, yep, that guy is ready for implementation. So you don't need a handy dandy enterprise size tool to actually groom and create a backlog.
It's a Kanban type of look to it, so it's visual left to right.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. Yep. Can you talk for a minute about what happens if the backlog on the left side of this just keeps accumulating stuff that may never get done, and it's maybe 400,000 lines long? Is there any element of cleanup that enters into this equation?
Yes, there is. So the good news about those situations is job security, because there's a ton of work coming, right? The bad news is you've probably got duplicate, triplicate, quadruplicate stories out there. You've got backlog items that are 3 words long. You've got product backlog items that just have an attached email from someone's brother who's not at the company anymore from 2012. You've got such a mixed bag of items, right? I've been lucky enough, I don't know if that's the right term, to inherit several long product backlogs from prior BAs who were on that team. And really what I've kind of found is it's a little bit of, it just takes time, and you're not going to, what's the analogy I want to use here? You're not going to boil the ocean all at once. One day you're not going to show up and refine all 400 PBIs to the point where they're ready to execute. And to be honest, that would be a poor use of your time, because the development team's not going to be able to output 400 PBIs within the next sprint. So some of the requirements you write might go stale, and you're going to need to reinvest your time in grooming them again anyways.
Sure. There's a question in the chat.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. So did you finish?
I was just going to say what I've tended to do with those inherited backlogs is whenever I get blocked or I have a little bit of downtime, I'll simply go to the list. I'll pluck whatever ones are on top, even if it's arbitrarily on top, and I'll start grooming it one by one, and it just kind of becomes a brute force fashion. What I get through, and what I don't, the sky doesn't fall. At least it hasn't on me yet.
Okay. Is the standard practice to append an ROI estimate onto backlog items?
It certainly can be. That can be part of your definition of ready, Whoever said that gets a bonus point.
All right.
All right. So what is a definition of ready? The definition of ready is what actually determines when a given product backlog item is set for implementation. You know, I told you guys I used to be a developer, so I had received, I'll say, good product backlog items with some clear acceptance criteria and a description I could relate to. I've also received product backlog items that had about 4 words in it, which was incredibly ambiguous. Bring data into warehouse. Okay, where do I go with this? The definition of ready, think of it as like a toll gate. It's a way to have that handoff between the requirements elicitation and the actual implementation starting. One thing I always think about with my project teams is that the developers I have are like a high-powered manufacturing piece of equipment. You know, one of those like that you'd find at a paper mill that eat up a whole building, right? These are huge, high-powered, expensive machines. So if I put really good raw inputs in front of that machine, chances are I'm going to get some really high-quality outputs from it. But if I put some junky inputs into that machine, that's only going to increase my odds of getting junky outputs as well. So, you know, if I give the team terrible requirements, I'm not helping them deliver the right thing the first time. Having a definition of ready will help me notate exactly what should be on a particular product backlog item before we will bring it into sprint planning and before we will let the team implement on it during the sprint.
Question about roles in this process. So I think a lot of people in the data space have at times wrestled with and probably are still wrestling with, like, you know, defining really, really good requirements for data warehouse projects often involves, like, you know, asking questions that you wouldn't think to ask unless you have like read Kimball and have some data modeling experience. So, like, you know, in a situation where to be able to get the requirements and be able to like really write a good set of requirements that can be developed, you need development experience, or at least a relatively, you know, decent level of understanding of how data modeling works. And the BA doesn't have that, right? Or has a minimal amount of that. How do you make this work? Do you just have to have a dev at the requirements gathering sessions, or like what's the most efficient way to manage that world?
Probably in the best case scenario, you have a tech lead who can sit down with the BA and say, hey, let me give you a quick crash course, right? I'm not going to teach you the book, but I'm going to say anytime you put together a new product backlog item, we need to know X, Y, or Z, you know, dim or fact, or, you know, tabular report versus visualization, whatever those high level components might be for an example. That would be preferred. And I say that because if you can kind of teach a man to fish, right, you don't have to keep fishing for that man. So you could make it work by implanting a developer into every single requirements meeting, but that's going to end up being a lot of time and a lot of investment over the course of your project. It can work, not arguing against it. I guess me being a selfish BA and wanting to be a good BA for my team, I would like to know that I've got all the tools in my noggin to be able to draft a story according to our shared definition of ready to hand over to the team and have them implement the right solution the first time. So it does involve some give and take there, but yeah, you can't just bring, especially on a data side, right? You can't just bring any BA in from off the street with zero data experience and expect them to craft product backlog items, which are very easy to understand from a data perspective. It's a little bit easier when you're talking about custom software or putting buttons on the screen or building a web page. That's a little bit more tangible. Data tends to be a little bit more conceptual for folks.
I'm curious if for any of the other, you know, devs or architects on the call, if you've ever taught a BA that, like if you've ever given that speech or that session where you teach a BA to what they need to know to gather requirements effectively, and if you have any tips for someone who might be in a position to need to do that.
Jeremiah, I don't know. I haven't but I know that we've been working quite a bit with our principal architects on kind of a template to help the BAs in their user stories related to data initiatives. And what we need to see in those stories to try and do our job. So I don't know if that helps at all.
Have you found that it's working? Like,
Yeah, I think so, especially when I got to go project to project, if there's some consistency into what I'm seeing. And I think it's helped some BAs that don't have a data analytics background or data analytics project background.
I'll look for a blog post from you on that.
A what?
Blog post.
What is it specifically that the BAs are missing?
Like for a complex kind of situation where there's, you know, like if there's row level security that needs to be applied in a particular way, or if there's different people who play different roles and depending on the situation, like whether you put them in one dimension or multiple dimensions and how you structure that relationship, you know, those get to be pretty, you know, head scratchy data modeling kinds of things. And there's projects where those things come up a lot.
We've tried to put key questions into that template. Row level security is one, slowly changing dimensions is another, and phrase it in business terms so they can help ask the right question, so that when we get it, we're like, okay, we've got to handle this like slowly changing dimension. And there's just lots of data related things that we're starting to include in those. But not everybody's on board. I don't know, Kurt, if you've seen any of that yet, but we're working on it.
I have not yet, but you've definitely piqued my interest nonetheless.
Can you teach a BA to at least know when to ask for a dev to be present? So that's the easy way around?
Yeah, that might be the easy way around.
That'd be a good idea. Like, here's the things you watch for. If you see one of these things, there's a rabbit hole involved. Mm-hmm. Stop and go get somebody.
That's not a bad idea. You know, how do you teach a BA just to find the warning signs, right? You know, where might this be stepping into a very technical space?
Our tech leads are in on the story refinement process on the current project that I'm on, and I found that I'm a developer on that team, not the tech lead on it. And as a developer, I found that very helpful because they're helping to add to those stories the additional bits of information that a developer needs.
Nice.
But that takes time. That's time, you know, another, you know, that your tech leads spending doing that versus developing. So
we use the same model though, Nicole, you know. So we've got the business requirements because the business don't know what a slowly changing dimension is. Mm-hmm. So you need to talk to them and get those. A BA needs to know how to identify something like that. But then our tech lead, you know, grooms those stories and does a technical review on them and gathers the technical requirements and decides architecture and stuff like that.
Mm-hmm.
That's good. Yeah. All right, we've got 15 minutes for what you've got left, Kurt. What do you want to hit?
I'm going to hit prioritizing a backlog. We're going to do that one next because that was a high vote getter.
Yeah.
So how do you prioritize a backlog, especially when you've got a long list of items, long list of enhancement requests? Chances are not every single item on that backlog delivers the same amount of business value. Some may be small tweaks, others may be mountains of capabilities that you're unleashing, right? And why is prioritizing a backlog important? This kind of gets back to our waterfall discussion earlier. Backlog prioritization really enables a business to be agile and to be nimble. Remember, if we're on a waterfall project and it takes 2 years to develop, all that risk and all that investment over 2 years just continues to grow and grow and grow, and there's $0, zero information that can be pulled back or can be obtained from it until it's deployed. Now, what happens if, I don't know, maybe a global pandemic breaks out? Is there a chance your 2-year-long project may now be solving for a problem that's obsolete? That's a lot of risk and a lot of dollars down the drain, right? So being able to prioritize all the different items in your backlog and have some bubble up at the right time, some bubble down based on changing economic scope, changing strategic initiatives, changing whatever the business wants to change, that enables that flexibility. And it kind of allows IT not to be looked at to say, look at how much money you spent over the last X amount of years, right? We kind of remove that bullseye from our back as well. One other thing to think about too is how do you sequence items in the backlog? You just, for example, if I'm building a web process and I've got a 6-step process, I'm not going to put the PBIs for all 6 of those steps into one sprint, because the user's got to get through step 1 to get to step 2, right? So if step 1 doesn't get done, how can I actually do step 2 in a successful way? And that just creates a log jam. There might be times I have to put the highest priority work in subsequent sprints where step 1 is in this sprint. Maybe I can do 2 and 3 concurrently in the next one. Then I do 4, then the next sprint is when 5 and 6 hit, for example.
Kurt, I have a question.
Go ahead.
Yeah.
This has been this came up on my current project, and I'm wondering how you handle this. Back in the waterfall days, and I used Microsoft Project to manage projects, it was really easy. And the subject is dependencies. And, we've got multiple developers working multiple stories. And how do you keep track of the dependencies? How are you doing that as a project manager or a Scrum Master?
A lot of times I'll use predecessor or successor linkages. I know Rally has that, for example. I also know Azure DevOps has that, but it at least allows me to map out a course where this product backlog item needs to be done before this one. And when that one's done, then any of these 3 could hit. And sometimes I can see that just through my BA lenses. Other times that's where having that tech lead involved, either in the refinement sessions or in a one-on-one, can help map out those dependencies.
Yeah. Thank you.
Kurt, another question for you with this.
Yep.
How often and who are your decision makers here? At the end of the day, who gets to choose what the higher priority is?
So think back to your scope box. What did you put into your scope box? What was that reasonably agreed to scope to be delivered? Anything that directly falls in that in scope category, that comes to the way top of the list. I tend to classify those as what we call musts. Those must get done or else we won't launch, right? They might be showstopper enough. There might be another set of features which maybe they're kind of mentioned in the scope box, but yet not explicitly, or maybe they're just new capabilities we thought of since the scope box was defined. We probably look at them and say, well, this is high value, but it's not super clear that they were in the scope box. So let's classify them as need. They have a high amount of business value we can hit, but they're not a showstopper, right? Then anything else kind of falls to a want.
Okay.
Go ahead.
So is that really pretty qualitative, and is it the dev team, the Scrum team that's really, all right, we got a bunch of these qualitative things. We're gonna say, all right, this really needs to rise to the top based on kind of how we think we've defined it, how you're feeling about this, or does the business owner get involved at all and say, all right, yeah, great, you like this, terrific, but this quantitative thing, which may not be as exciting, but it's quantitative, I can put value on it, that really needs to come first. Where does that, because that just leads to conflict for sure.
Yeah, the product owner should definitely be involved. I think the most efficient way to assign some of these priorities is for whoever is leading the business analysis efforts or the requirements elicitation efforts, have them assign one of these priorities to that product backlog item. And then when you take it to your product owner for approval, say, well, I classified this as a need for these 3 reasons. They have the power of changing that decision and saying, no, this is a must. And in a case like that, if it's a brand new must that wasn't in the scope box, okay, well then what else is going to change between your timeline and your budget? Because I've got a 5-gallon pail, and if we filled it full 2 weeks ago, you can't put any more water in there, right? I either need a bigger pail or I need to take some water out.
You get a waterfall.
You get a water. Oh, geez,
Thanks.
that was an unintended pun. Yeah, and there's lots of different ways to work these different classifications. But in general, you need to find some way to differentiate some of your product backlog items from the others. And for those that especially inherit a backlog, or you find yourself working on a project team with hundreds or thousands of items in that backlog, I'm asking you to please not torture yourself by going item by item and force ranking every single one against all the others. Come up with a higher level grouping, even if it's stuff we might want to get done in 2021 versus stuff we might want to get done in 2022 versus stuff we might want to get done in 2023. You can go to that high level and that's okay. Questions? All right, I'm going to jump over to the definition of done. This one is similar to the definition of ready, except this defines when deliverables are worthy of eliciting additional feedback. Worded another way, this really defines when something could achieve some sort of value. Done does not mean a developer is done writing their code. Done does not mean I've checked it in. Done means we have created, or we have taken the product backlog item, we've understood the what, and we've brought it to life, and it's been verified. It's been tested, it's been signed off on. It's been confirmed that we implemented the right thing the first time. We could have some debates on, does it have to be releasable? Does it not? I think in the interest of time, I'll just say, I don't believe the definition of done has to include the term releasable. But again, this is a bulleted list, kind of like some of the other artifacts we've talked about. What truly defines done? Some of these bullet points are fairly intuitive. All code has been checked in. The build doesn't break. Other times you have lines in your definition of done that says the tester has verified all the acceptance criteria has been met. You have additional pieces where, hey, you could even have non-functional pieces like the coding changes do not increase the data warehouse processing time by more than 10 minutes each day. So you've got some functional related, some non-functional to make sure everything that was delivered for that backlog item does not have any negative consequences that were unforeseen. So there's business requirements that get baked into your definition of done, plus quality ones, plus non-functional pieces. And only when a PBI has hit all of those bullet points can that work be considered done. That word should be considered magical and not abused to say, well, I've done my work. I'm done with the requirements. I'm done with the developing. Wrong use of the term. Questions there? I know I'm going very quick, very high level in the interest of time. Nicole says I can't keep you guys here until midnight, so.
Good.
All right, I'm gonna just skip over testing and verification. I'll go to the last one that you guys voted highly, which was tracking dependencies. How do you track dependencies? Now, that term dependency is ambiguous, right? That can mean a lot of different things. I think someone asked the question earlier of how do you track dependencies in your backlog? That's one set of dependencies. What I'm really focusing on with this slide is how do you track those influences that are outside of your team's control that could definitely have an impact to your ability to succeed. So, for example, if you have an unstable source system, that probably impacts your ability of writing ETL logic, which will be successful in running 100% of the time. Because as that source system is volatile, that might shake or rattle your ETL logic loose, right? For how to track dependencies, basically we need to stop talking about them so much and get them out of our minds. And again, get them down on paper. And why do we get them down on paper? Why do we open up a Word document or a OneNote? Why do we put them there? It ultimately helps protect the team. Because someday, like again, I'll go back to just the simple ETL based project. If you don't hit your deadline, 2 days before that day hits is not the time to raise your hand and say, well, yeah, we're not going to make it because the source system has been pretty fluky and pretty volatile. That's the wrong time to be promoting that blocker. It's too late, right? You need to make it ever visible, and we need to make sure to call out those issues way ahead of time. The simplest approach that I've used, I'll just jump to my next slide, is a simple stop and go light. Go back to my Amazon example. Let's say we want to work with some providers to sell keyboards, and we want to work with some providers to sell monitors. And in this case, I've just got 3 high-level steps that a customer would go down. Completing an order, confirming an order with that third-party provider, and then providing shipment status updates. If all of these capabilities, if our team has to do something with these capabilities, but yet we don't have full ownership of them, having this simple stop and go light approach can showcase, hey, look, our blockers have been removed. Everything appears stable. Our code seems to be jiving with their code. I don't see an issue. A yellow might be, some things are working, but it's a little shaky. And red just means, something's wrong. Something is clearly not working. There is something subconsciously, as the higher I think folks move up the food chain in a business sense, the more they see red colors, the more scared they get. You can use that to your advantage here. This simple stop and go light approach, when we've utilized it, it's really helped to identify how sometimes our project teams aren't put into a chance to succeed because we're handcuffed by so many other dependencies outside of the team itself. This stops people from talking about it. And when we talk about those dependencies, again, subconsciously, we bring the emotion to the table. We tend to complain, not just state the facts. This visual, red, yellow, green, there's no emotion here. This is just a fact. I can't do anything with shipment status updates. I'm not blaming anyone. I'm just telling you our team cannot do anything with shipment status updates, right?
Yep.
Questions from the group?
When I saw that, I thought risks. Often what I hear in project management terminology or whatever is, at least noting risks somewhere, not dependencies. Is this just a terminology thing?
You could apply this to risks as well. I think the two of them could kind of go back and forth. Yeah.
Okay. Any questions?
I won't touch too much on status reports. I'll just say, if you ever find yourself needing to produce them, there's a lot of free templates online. Use the Google robot to be your friend. All right. I will pause there. Definitely, if there are any other questions, comments, concerns, issues, or challenges, happy to field them. I know we went a little bit over, so I do thank everyone for your patience.
No, not a problem. This was excellent. We had a lot of good discussion. We had to compress some of the lower. I'm glad that you got feedback from the groups, because we could compress what down things and get what people are most interested in talking about. That was excellent. Yeah, mostly your fault.
I have a couple for you, Kurt.
What you got?
Go ahead. Okay. The one is storming, the storming period, where you're forming that new team and you're trying to, everybody's trying to get used to each other. You got a new project, and it just seems like that first sprint is just hectic and not as productive. And do you have any suggestions for that?
Suggestion number 1, embrace the suck. Sometimes it's not fun. Brand new teams in a first sprint, it will be rocky. It's a technology set that maybe folks haven't used before. It's a code check-in process folks aren't used to. It's a brand new technology set with someone gathering the requirements who's brand new to it. There will be a lot of speed bumps. Go into it with an open mind. acknowledge that everyone on the team will make a mistake at some point over the first couple of sprints, but use it as an opportunity to notate things on the side, a little post-it note or a notebook, and bring them up during your sprint retros, especially if you're running in a Scrum format. Say, hey, this project seems like one where we could, make some sort of a tweak, and see if the team agrees. See if they think, yes, that would actually make us more effective or efficient. Maybe bringing the tech lead into more refinement calls, for example, or maybe a certain developer with extensive knowledge in a particular part of the system, but not the whole system. The one thing that we can't really teach, right, and we can't really put into a book is experience. In working with other imperfect human beings is just that. It's an experience. You kind of have to do it. You have to go through that fun process.
I think I'd want to add that you need to make your stakeholder aware of that. At least one consulting thing I was on, that stakeholder was very disappointed in the results of sprint 1. We got the team, we got the environment, systems were setting up and all of that. And I just don't think that that was explained to them very well. So I think, informing your stakeholder too, really having that discussion that, hey, there's a ramp up here,
Think of it in terms of, when you try to get on the highway, I've got to get out of my driveway. I've got to drive down the road. I've got to get to the Highway 41 exchange. Then I get on that on-ramp when I start speeding up, right? I'm not pulling out of my driveway at 70 miles an hour. It takes a little bit to get to the right spot for me to accelerate. If I accelerate too fast, I'm going to be in my neighbor's living room with my vehicle. And while they want to see me, I'm sure they don't want to see me that way.
Nice. Excellent. Well, thank you so much for that presentation and the final question and answer. And now, Nicole, I invite you to stop the recording so that we can have everyone get a chance to turn on their cameras